Hello, everybody. I'm going to start. So this is Guatemala. You can see how close it is to the United States. There's a long and tangled history there that I probably won't get into in my presentation, because I want to talk about this guy right here for just a minute. His name is Benito Lucas Garcia. He's short and stout, but he has a very commanding presence. At age 85, he's spry and alert. As you can see, his angular face is framed by those silver glasses. And he always seems like he's standing at attention, which makes sense because he's a brigadier general of the Guatemalan Army, now retired. I first learned about Lucas Garcia when I was a college student in the mid-1980s. The United States had cut off military aid to Guatemala around 1979 after reports of brutal military massacres came to light. A few years later, however, the United States changed its mind, reinstating military aid and supporting a series of military regimes that it believed were helping its Cold War mission to stop the advance of communism in the Americas. I never imagined I would see Lucas Garcia in person, much less under arrest, as you see him here, and put on trial for human rights violations committed during the time he was Army Chief of Staff of the Guatemalan Army, during the government of his brother, Romeo Lucas Garcia, between 1978 and 1982. Not only did he hold absolute power when he was head of the Guatemalan Army, long after he stepped out of that role, he remained a very powerful man. Yet over the past 2 years, and most recently this past May, which doesn't quite count as summer, but there you go, I have seen Lucas Garcia quite frequently in that courtroom. I have watched as he was escorted by police who were transferring from his prison cell to the courtroom in downtown Guatemala City, where he was on trial for the illegal detention, torture, and sexual violence of a 21-year-old woman at the time in 1981, and the enforced disappearance of her 14-year-old brother. I watched as he offered his defense, protesting his innocence, saying he did not have command control of the army, yet at the same time saying he was on the front line combating the guerrillas in arm-to-arm combat. I watched on May 23rd, 2018, when he and 3 other senior military officials were convicted of crimes against humanity, aggravated sexual violence against Emma, Molina Tyson, and the enforced disappearance of her brother, Marco Antonio Molina Tyson. He and the others were sentenced to between 33 and 58 years in prison. Over the past decade, my research has focused on how societies that experienced internal armed conflicts and massive violations of human rights have sought to build peaceful societies while also reckoning with the legacies of violence for survivors, families of victims, and for society at large. How do societies remember and represent the past? How do they process conflicts about what happened during those times? How do societies address the demands of survivors and victims for justice and reparation? What do societies do to ensure that such abuses do not happen again in the future? I meant to flip to this image as I was speaking, and I got wrapped up in my speaking. This is Emma Molina Tyson, who was 21 years old at the time she was arrested and detained. She was a member of a left-wing political party that was at the time banned by the Guatemalan Constitution, and she was the one who was, as I said, tortured, sexually violated. While she was in detention, she managed to escape. And the military, realizing that she was an important, two things. They realized that she had important information about the party that they were seeking to eliminate, but also she had been inside a military base and she had seen a lot of the things that the clandestine military structures were doing, and so that made her dangerous. So they went to her parents' house and tried to find her. They did not find her. They found her mother and her brother, who at the time was 14, and that's who you see here, Marco Antonio. And not finding her, they decided that it would be a good idea to detain her brother. To this day, Marco Antonio remains missing, and his parents do not know what happened to him, nor where his body lies. There you see a close-up of Lucas Garcia. Some of the things that societies in post-conflict societies like Guatemala do to deal with these issues of the past, is some societies do nothing, right? They want to bury the past and try to move forward. But that has become increasingly viable as global justice norms have consolidated in favor of the rights of victims, and a series of human rights international law mechanisms have been consolidated. So increasingly you see societies develop truth commissions that examine the causes and consequences of violence, reparations policies for victims and survivors, criminal prosecutions that seek to put those responsible behind bars, lustration or vetting that seeks to remove those who violated human rights from positions of public influence or power, memorials and memorialization to remember the victims and their suffering, national commissions to search for the disappeared. 45,000 people were disappeared in the Guatemalan armed conflict. They also engage in reforms of the security sector, the justice sector, and other parts of government to try to ensure that these kinds of abuses don't occur again. Here you see the family. This is the mom, Emma, and her two sisters. This was right after the conviction, where they finally achieved justice for their case, but they still don't know what happened to Marco Antonio. How much time do I have?
25 minutes. No, 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, so I can't really do what I wanted to do, which was talk about, give a little bit about the conflict in Guatemala. I think I'll skip that. And I'll focus on, you can see that the US had a big role there, that there was internal armed conflict between 1960 and 1996, that there were peace accords in 96 that brought an end to the conflict. There were two truth commissions. And then the CICIG was established, and I'll talk about that in a moment. These are some of the findings of the Truth Commission, and you can see here, 93% of the abuses committed were the responsibility of the military, and the Truth Commission determined that the military was responsible for acts of genocide in 5 regions of the country, primarily between the periods in which Lucas Garcia was head of the army and the subsequent government of Rios Montt, who I also had the opportunity to view while he was on trial in 2013. Typically, what you saw in Guatemala immediately after the peace accords and the transition was no action on human rights abuses. But that began to slowly change. And one of the things I'm trying to do in my research is to understand how things change. And so here you can see, I mean, it's not really a lot if you think about it, but these are a series of cases that have convictions, with 2 exceptions, the genocide cases. Convictions of military officials, civil defense patrollers, and in the case of the Molina Tyson trial, several senior military officials. So what I try to do in my research is look at what facilitated the emergence of these trials in Guatemala. And there are 4 key factors, and I'm not going to be able to go into them, but I'll just enumerate them. First is the fact that human rights violations were documented intensively during the conflict itself by survivors, by family members of victims, and by human rights organizations and the Catholic Church, and journalists as well, and sometimes by academics. And that documentation has been critical as proof in these trials, particularly given the absence or lack of access to official military documents, although we have been able to obtain some military documents in recent years. Second is the fact that there are what I like to call justice activist networks. Again, it's the same group of people. It's survivors, families of victims, human rights organizations, as well as practitioners, journalists, some academics, and others who remain committed to the belief, that families and victims have a right to access justice, rights that are codified in international law. Excuse me. Third is the international role, and this is very complex. I'll try to break it down real quickly. One is, in Latin America, human rights victims, when they don't find justice in the domestic courts, they have the right to go to the Inter-American System, which is part of the Organization of American States. And Guatemalan victims have used this system quite extensively. There have been a series of rulings handed down ordering the state of Guatemala to investigate, prosecute, and punish grave violations of human rights. Thank you.
That's from me, is that okay?
Yeah. Thank you. And the treaty obligations that Guatemala has acquired because of this, its acceptance of the OAS Convention, is it's obligated to carry out these rulings. So that's one thing. Second is foreign courts. Victims have taken their cases to Spain using the concept of universal jurisdiction. And right here in the United States, where perpetrators often come to live, trying to hide and live out the rest of their days, folks in the Department of Justice and in ICE track them down and send them home where they may face prosecution. And that's happened in Guatemala as well. Finally, there's this UN unique body called the CC, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. And I don't have time to get into it. It's been in the news lately. The president is trying to get rid of it. In fact, he said that he will no longer, after this year, he will not renew its mandate. He's preventing the commissioner from returning to Guatemala. Even as the UN reiterates that the commissioner will stay on as head of the CC. But this is a unique experiment in bringing international expertise to a country that is virtually failing in checking the power of illegal, clandestine security networks, and that's having a difficult time overcoming impunity. And the CC has provided sort of a covering role for strengthening both the judiciary and the Attorney General's office. And I can't get into the details because of lack of time, but the role has been absolutely important, even though CC can't technically get involved in cases related to crimes of the past. And the last thing is the role of a new generation of prosecutors and judges who are just trying to do their job with integrity and honesty. And here are two examples of women. The first two women attorney generals in Guatemala, Claudia Paz y Paz and Telma Aldana, who have both brought incredible cases for corruption and abuse of authority, as well as human rights cases. Just to end, I just want to say I think these trials are critically important, not only because they provide acknowledgement of the crimes committed by the state, and they provide some level of redress to victims, but they also challenge the narratives of denial that persist in countries like Guatemala, where those actors, the actors who committed abuses, remain extremely powerful and often control networks that produce the narratives that we hear every day in the news and in newspapers. I think it's also important because Guatemala is one of those developing nations trying desperately to consolidate rule of law. And one of the things these trials help to establish is that no one, not even powerful men like Lucas Garcia, are above the law. Last but not least, I think these trials help empower survivors, victims, and society at large. Citizens' subjectivity has changed in part as a result of these trials that are combating corruption and human rights abuses in Guatemala. And I think though the response of the powerful actors who still remain powerful, there's been a lot of backlash. There's an ongoing struggle to push forward with these cases and further strengthen Guatemala's democracy and rule of law. Thank you very much.